Welcome back to the Midnight Mystery Archive and Witness Wednesday. For those of you who are new to this format, Witness Wednesday is a recurring series within the Midnight Mystery Archive where I sit down with people who have genuine proximity to the cases we cover. It could be family, it could be friends, or it could be like last week, the video editor on the cruise where Amy Bradley disappeared. This week, we're going to bring a legal perspective to Witness Wednesday. Michael Winkleman is an attorney and partner at Lipcon, Margulies Winkleman in Miami, one of the most experienced maritime law firms in the United States. His firm has recovered more than $500 million on behalf of passengers and crew who have been injured, assaulted, or lost at sea. They were instrumental in the advocacy that produced the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010. Michael has handled landmark cases including the Faro disaster and the Costa Concordia claims. He appeared more than 100 times on national television, including the Today Show, Good Morning America, and 2020. This is my conversation with Michael Winkleman. Enjoy. Michael, thanks for joining me and providing your expert insights as it relates to jurisdiction when it comes to cruise ships. So I wanted to start with a few questions for you, really just to kind of set the table for listeners. So when a crime or a disappearance happens on a cruise ship, who has jurisdiction and how is it determined?
Well, first, Kevin, thanks for having me on the show. I'm happy to be here. I know this is a very high-profile incident, and people are really fascinated by it. And I always say I enjoy my line of work for a lot of reasons because I get to help people. But being a cruise ship attorney, people are just fascinated by everything that happens on the high seas, for good or for bad. And obviously, this was a terrible tragedy, regardless of why it happened, how it happened, et cetera. It's a real horror for the family. And I wish there was a way they could have some certainty. But in terms of the question of who has jurisdiction, okay, it's a very complex question. If we're talking about a U.S. citizen or resident, that makes it a lot easier because then the FBI has jurisdiction. You always have the flag state that has jurisdiction. You have this concept called flags of convenience. When you go on a cruise ship, they're generally flagged with Bahamas, Panama, Liberia. They call those flags of convenience because it's convenient for the cruise line, because that makes it more favorable for them from a tax perspective as well as a labor law perspective. Lastly, you would have jurisdiction over where the incident occurred. So if it happened in Italy, you could have Italian jurisdiction, you could have Bahamian jurisdiction as the flag state, and you could have FBI jurisdiction that they're given for U.S. citizens or residents. So it's a very muddy picture.
Yeah, so you make a point as it relates to flags of convenience. So why is it that so many cruise lines register in countries like the Bahamas or Panama rather than the United States? Is it truly just a tax law and labor law,
In my
motivation,
view,
or is there more to it?
from my perspective, those are two gigantic reasons. I mean, the taxes they save are likely through the roof. Yes, they do pay a lot of taxes to the U.S., port taxes, sales tax type things, but the labor laws also are huge. I mean, so I represent not only passengers that get hurt on cruise ships. I also represent crew members that are hurt on cruise ships. They are all, in my opinion, all but allowed to get away with murder on crew members because there's so little law that applies to them as it relates to their injuries. Passengers, it's completely different. You are required to sue in federal court in Miami. You've got a lot of favorable law for them. Those are still tough cases, but there's still a body of law that says they have to use reasonable care. With crew members, there's very little laws that actually protect them. Cruise lines take advantage of that. I am, thank goodness, able to still be successful with crew member cases. But to answer your question, to me, the tax savings and the absence of labor laws, those are gigantic reasons for them to fly flags of convenience. Are there other ones from a corporate perspective? That's beyond my purview, but absolutely, they must exist.
Okay, great. So when a passenger, we'll use a scenario like the Amy Bradley case, a passenger is reported missing on a cruise ship. What is the cruise line typically legally required to do in that instant?
Well, so what they're legally required to do is have reasonable care in undertaking efforts to find the person. But what's unique about it is, unless the cruise line was able to see with video evidence that a person went overboard, then in which case they would immediately undertake man overboard rescue operations. If they don't know that and someone just says, "Hey, Sally is missing," they're going to undertake an entire search of the vessel itself before they undertake any man overboard efforts. So you have this built-in system where unless they see someone go over, they're just going to search the entire ship. Which, yes, it's reasonable, but think about it. These are gigantic ships. For them to actually find someone is sort of like finding a needle in a haystack.
Yeah. And in that initial response, who is often the responsible party? Is it ship security? Is it the captain, local port authorities? Because in this case, they were already in port in Curacao. Or does the FBI immediately become the agency of record and note?
Well, I think the important point here is you're always going to have this inherent lag time that really keeps the entirety of the investigation entirely in the hands of the cruise line. So, because you're always going to have a period of time before they know the person's missing, before they would actually report the person missing. So, you're always going to have this window that exists that allows the cruise line to be the only one that's involved in the investigation. And when they actually alert the authorities, that's generally up to them. So, cruise line always the first one on the scene. Not only that, they control all access to the ship. So even if they are in port in Curacao, they are the ones who have to let the Curacao authorities onto the vessel. So you have this inherent imbalance of information where the cruise line has total access to all information, and everyone else needs to ask for permission to get on the ship to try to get that information. I don't sit around bashing the cruise lines. I sue them for a living. They don't want bad things to happen to their passengers. They wanna make money. They wanna give people
Yeah.
positive experience. So don't think that I'm gonna come on here and say a lot of negative things about them, but I will talk about what I think are systemic imbalances, and this fact that they have total control over the information is really one of the big ones.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So, one of the things you just alluded to was delays. So, when there's a delay in a response, it sounds like it's typically a structural delay about how authority works within the instance from the time somebody is said to have been disappeared or can't be accounted for. Would you agree that it's really just a structural issue at that point? It's because they're probably not thinking in terms of legal at that point. They're just trying to wrap their heads around what's going on at that moment and how do we respond.
I agree that it's structural. I disagree that they're not thinking about legal. I think the cruise
Okay.
industry is always thinking about legal. And so huge point is there is no independent law enforcement on cruise ships. Uh, it's all
Right.
cruise ship security guards. Those cruise ship security guards are there to protect the company, in my experience and opinion. So when something bad happens, even if it's a slip and fall on a ship, someone breaks their leg, they're always going to be looking at angles to, okay, well, how can we protect the company here? How can we limit the exposure here? Same thing applies in the criminal context, in my opinion. I'm not saying they're looking to cover up crimes, but I'm saying since there's no independent law enforcement and the first people on site are employees that are paid by the cruise line that are designed, the part of their job duty is to protect the cruise line, you've got a dangerous element that if there was any nefarious intent could certainly be easily taken advantage of. And yes, I agree with you, it is structural. It's part of the
Yeah.
structure of the cruise industry that just by the nature of the cruise industry that they operate these gigantic floating cities that they grant all access to the people on gives them an incredible advantage in terms of the flow of information.
Great. So, how would you describe the chain of custody or the chain of authority to someone who's never thought about it in the instance of a crime on board a cruise ship?
Well, it doesn't really vary from a crime in Manhattan. Chain of custody and preservation of evidence, those are basic principles for preserving a crime scene. In my experience, the security guards on the ship are well trained. A lot of them have law enforcement backgrounds. They are certainly required to properly maintain the sites, properly preserve evidence. I deal with that frequently in what I do from a civil side. But, common sense goes a long way. Don't touch anything, preserve the scene. If you do find evidence, make sure you're wearing gloves when you handle it. Make sure you're properly putting it in a bag. If you transfer it to anyone else, you're documenting the transfer of the evidence.
Right. So, in a scenario where you have an American citizen has a crime committed against them, disappears, y- under what circumstances does the FBI have jurisdiction over that case when it occurs on a cruise ship?
If it involves a U.S. resident or citizen, they invariably have jurisdiction over the crime. 100%. That's part and parcel. If it's someone who's a foreigner, then they wouldn't have jurisdiction if not an American citizen. But if you're talking about someone like Amy Bradley, who was a U.S. citizen, absolutely FBI has jurisdiction. But by the time you have something bad that happens, by the time it's reported, by the time the FBI is able to get up to speed on it, 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, particularly if you're talking about something that happens halfway around the world. I mean, there's cruises in Japan. I mean, think about how difficult it would be for them to actually be able to get there in any kind of timely fashion. And that's just that structural imbalance that we've been talking about, Kevin.
Yeah, and as a point of note, in Amy's case, it was about 48 hours after the initial report that she couldn't be accounted for that the FBI was able to get to the ship and begin a proper investigation. So that fits with what you're alluding to. So what does it look like when the FBI engages in a maritime case? Do they handle them differently than they would something that occurred on land?
Well, that's hard for me to answer. I've dealt with the FBI a ton in my cases, but I haven't dealt with them in a non-cruise ship case. So it's hard for me to compare that. So all I could talk about is the cruise ship context. And I mean, they're terrific. They're great at doing their job. Obviously, that's what they're trained to do. I will say sometimes, and not knocking the FBI, but it's not a lot of these cases are not always at the top of their priority list when you're talking about cruise ship crimes like rapes and sexual assaults, and that's completely understandable because they probably are so overburdened with so many things from so many different directions. But so I can't give a comparative analysis. I can say when they are involved, I think it's a good thing because they're giving a level of independence that is needed for any criminal investigation.
Yeah, good. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act. Can you explain what the act is and what it requires of cruise lines?
So the Cruise Vessel Safety and Security Act of 2010 was a wonderful thing that our law firm and a number of our former clients lobbied incredibly hard to get passed. It has a lot of different nuance to it. For me, the really big thing was the reporting requirements. Prior to the CVSSA, which it's referred to, there were no reporting requirements from the cruise ship industry in terms of crimes, rapes, sexual assaults, thefts, overboards, missing persons. All of that was very much just voluntarily turned over if and when it was requested. And so for there to become this mandatory reporting requirement really was a huge game changer for the industry. I still think there's issues there in terms of the accuracy of what's reported, in my opinion. And I think that has to do with what we talked about with sort of this information imbalance. We can talk about that if you want to. The other big points would be overboard technology. If someone goes overboard, what the CVSSA says that to the extent the technology exists, cruise ships are required to have technology to detect people when they go overboard. Of course, I hate that language. It says to the extent that technology exists, because that really gives something of a get out of jail free card to the cruise industry to say, well, the technology doesn't really exist. Having said that, for the most part, most cruise ships do have some level of technology to detect when people go overboard. But CVSSA as a whole, wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, really everything you just captured there, because that happens in 2010, right? Amy disappears in 1998. So some of the things that you just highlighted were the reality of what happened when she disappeared. So it's good to see that there have been steps taken to improve the response and the reporting and the requirements of the cruise lines in the event that something similar were to happen.
To add a little color to that, Kevin, I always say generally, I think the cruise ship industry is dramatically underregulated. And I think that the CVSA is an exception to that, where there was some more regulation put in place. Of course, the other glaring exception to my comment would be COVID, where they shut down the entire industry, et cetera. But that's very much a one-off. But I just think that the inherent nature of the cruise ship, where they fly flags of convenience, they have these gigantic floating cities where there is no independent law enforcement. I don't think the cruise ship industry as a whole has any intent other than to make money, which is fine. I don't think they're bad actors. There are exceptions to that comment, in my opinion. But as a whole, they want people to have wonderful trips for their families. Having said that, in my opinion, I think they're dramatically underregulated industry as a whole.
I tend to agree with that. And I think that's why this conversation is so important in relation to this particular case. So I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm going to ask some of these questions anyways, because I think it would be good insight. When a family is dealing with a disappearance or a family member that can't be accounted for or potentially was the victim of a crime on a cruise ship, what legal rights do they actually have in that moment?
Well, that's a great question for me because remember, with the law, you got two sides. You got the criminal side and you got the civil side. The criminal side is you have investigating authorities. I have really nothing to do with that. I don't have any ability to charge a person with a crime. On the civil side, that's what I do is I sue the cruise lines for negligence, saying they did something wrong with the singular effort of getting justice for my clients, which really, fortunately or unfortunately, just is money. That's the remedy that is afforded in our justice system. And we've been doing that for over 50 years and we're really good at it. And I've been doing it for more than 20 years. And I'm very honored to get to represent families when they're at their worst times. And it's very hard for them. And I see the pain and I see the hardship. So for a family like the Bradley family, I mean, it's your worst nightmare. And I've had very similar cases to that. And what's nice is when I sue civilly, that gives me an opportunity to conduct discovery, which lets me take depositions. It lets me get evidence. It lets me ask questions, which is similar to a criminal investigation, but with a different ultimate intent. So generally speaking, it's nice to be able to answer the questions that families that are in crisis want to know. And then if there's some level of negligence that's shown, generally speaking, I can be successful in a civil action. Certainly doesn't bring a person like Amy back, maybe gives you a drop in the bucket in terms of closure, but something is better than nothing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hardest things, and I think that is a good segue into my next question. So what is the single most important thing a family should do if something goes wrong on a cruise?
Well, you've got a ton of variables there, but of course, the number one most important thing is getting it reported right away so that all applicable authorities are investigating it. And I do think reaching out to a competent maritime attorney is key too, because they're going to make sure you're doing it in the right way to protect yourself from a criminal as well as a civil perspective. So to me, it's a no-brainer to make sure you're reporting it and you're getting the right parties involved to be able to help you.
Right. So in your time, in your profession, has the cruise industry's approach to passenger safety changed significantly in any way, or are you finding yourself still fighting some of the same battles that you did earlier in your career?
I think it's been pretty static. I think the motivation for the cruise line has always been the same. Try to keep passengers safe. You have a good vacation. And I think things just happen when you have a floating city with thousands of people. Bad things are going to happen. I think the cruise line generally tries to do their best, but I do also think that what I talked about before, Kevin, is just that a lot of times when bad things happen, in my opinion, the cruise line and the cruise industry as a whole is going to take subtle little steps to always protect themselves. And that can come from, so even as routine as a slip and fall case, they put a statement in front of them and they ask these questions to them that are designed to get them to say answers that aren't favorable to them, protecting the cruise industry. In the crime context, what I see often is someone who's a victim of rape or sexual assault. They will say things to them like, "Oh, are you sure you want to report this? You don't want it to go on your record. It's going to be a he said, she said. It's going to be there for the rest of their lives." And that to me is that subtle way of trying to protect the company and prevent things from coming to light. And what I said about 10 minutes ago, that I thought there were still issues with the mandatory reporting requirements, where I've seen that in my time of doing this for more than 20 years, when they're telling people not to report it, that's creating, I think, what is a big gap in the accuracy of the reporting.
And I assume you see that often or just more often than you should?
Well, I think I see it extremely often in both cases, both in the slip and fall case where they're just trying to protect themselves by getting you to say something that harms your case, and in the criminal context. No, criminal context is not the right word. When there's a crime committed on a cruise ship, I see efforts to dissuade passengers from reporting it often.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. What do you want the public to understand about what happens legally, structurally, when a crime is committed on a cruise ship or they're the victim of a crime?
Well, the lead into that is what I always tell people is don't leave your common sense at the port. For some reason, people go on cruise ships and think they're in this magical, safe bubble where nothing can happen. Yet, when you get on that ship with your family, it is no different than getting off a plane in Manhattan. You've got the same amount of risks. You've got the same amount of dangers. I don't know many people that would let their 14-year-old roam free in Manhattan, but for some reason, parents will let that 14-year-old roam free on a cruise ship, and that can really be a recipe for disaster. And then in terms of the industry as a whole, I do think it's generally safe. You can't leave your common sense at the port. You got to keep yourself and your family safe like you would in any big city. And yeah, I think the cruise industry is so incredibly unique because you've got these gigantic floating hotels slash cities. You have no independent law enforcement. You have this gigantic information imbalance that really sets up the cruise line to be successful in protecting themselves when something bad happens, which is all the more reason to bring your common sense with you on the ship.
Yeah, this is really great insight, Michael, and I appreciate you taking the time to answer some of these questions. I think it gives a lot of added context around the specific case I'm covering with this series, but also some good, tangible things that people who might be going on a cruise in the future should be thinking about. And I really appreciate you taking the time. Great insight. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Kevin. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's a really interesting topic that people are fascinated about. So let's keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you.